Hello, cruel, cruel world. In 1996, Michael Stone was convicted of the murders of complete strangers Lynn and Megan Russell and the attempted murder of Josie Russell. This all happened in Kent in South England. He was sentenced to 3 life sentences with a tariff of 25 years. That's the minimum amount of time in prison, 25 years. So, how did these heinous murders spark off a government campaign to indefinitely detain dangerous people? What is dangerous and severe personality disorder? Why is it controversial as a diagnosis, and why was it a monumental waste of money? I will answer all of these questions and more in this episode. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders for a living so that you don't have to. You can call me the ominous Sohominous. Grab your favourite prison cell key and throw it away, and welcome to the Psych for Sore Minds. As always, I'm going to start off with this true life case. I'm going to give you a trigger warning. This is fairly horrific, so if you're about to tuck into your dinner, which is obviously a microwave meal for one, then you've been warned, because the perpetrator is a nasty piece of work, by which obviously I mean a nasty piece of shit. So I'm going to put on my serious face and turn the joke meter down out of respect for the victims of what I'm about to talk about. So as I said, Michael Stone was convicted in 1996 of the murders of Lynn and Megan Russell and the attempted murder of Josie Russell. Let's take it back to the concrete streets, original beats and real live MCs for a bit of background. So Stone had a turbulent childhood, and he suffered from domestic violence and was placed into a care home where he was apparently abused. He reportedly had been beaten with a hammer and witnessed his mother's former partner attack another man with a meat cleaver. So I think it's fair to say he had pretty rough beginnings. Stone had a criminal record from the age of 12, and he began using heroin. Then he soon became addicted. Then he served multiple prison sentences in the 80s and 90s for robbery and burglary, and also grievous bodily harm. On top of all of that, he was known to carry around knives and guns, and he was apparently a well-known figure in the Medway underworld, Medway being in Kent. And according to my research, another offence that he would commit is that he would regularly steal from people's gardens, which might not sound like much, but it can be a serious offence. Make no mistake. High five.
No.
No, okay. And he would also mug people at cash dispensers, and he attacked a number of prison officers, so an all-round rotten egg. Stone had been violent towards a number of former partners, and he was actually suspected of a murder of a man in 1976, a man who was found dead in a park, 65-year-old man from Guernsey who died from multiple stab wounds in the stomach and in the head. Stone was only 16 at the time, and he was a suspect, but he was never found guilty. Could argue there's no smoke without fire, but he was not found guilty in a court of law. So that's his background. We've got the man's origin story. What happened during this atrocious crime? On the 9th of July 1996, in a country lane in Kent, Lynn Russell, aged 45, and her 2 daughters, 6-year-old Megan and 9-year-old Josie, and their dog Lucy, were tied up. They were savagely beaten with a hammer whilst they were walking home from a swimming gala. So Lynn, Megan and the dog were killed, but Josie survived and made a recovery. So what had happened is they walked past the car before Stone got out of the car wielding a claw hammer and demanding money. So they actually offered to go home and get some money, but he tied them up and he bludgeoned them to death. And in the weeks after his murder, before his arrest, Stone and an accomplice carried out a robbery somewhere else. In July 1997, police charged and arrested Stone, who was 37 years old, after tip-offs from a reconstruction of a Crime Watch television programme. So for our non-UK viewers, Crime Watch helps police solve and catch perpetrators at large. And the way that it did this is it would show public reconstructions and other evidence on the TV, such as CCTV footage. It's kind of like a game show, but the main prize is a prison centre.
I don't see why we make the place rock. Turn it up a little, burn it up a little, what?
You all saw Crime Watch. The photo fit was amazing. All black with long blonde hair. I could have been Asian.
If you don't know what that song is about, it's Thai, Turn It Up a Little. That is for my true UK hip hop heads out there. R.I.P. Thai, rest in peace. You Bombay! So a psychiatrist as well as 2 nursing staff members called the programme Crime Watch, reporting that they believed that it was Stone. They'd worked with him in the lead up to the attacks, and a few days before the murder he was increasingly enraged, he was aggressive, and he threatened to kill individual staff members and also their families. But if you are seeing a psychiatrist, don't worry. Usually we live by the code, snitches get stitches. The exception being if you've murdered several people. Joking aside, there are actually exceptional circumstances where a doctor, a psychiatrist can break confidentiality. In fact, I've done a whole video on exactly when these circumstances are. Go check it out on my channel. Always be plugging. The psychiatrist said that Stone had threatened his probation officer with a hammer, and he reported fantasies that Stone had told him, which tied in with the nature of this attack. So Stone had openly told a psychiatric nurse that he felt like killing children while walking around in the woods, and that he dreamt about torturing people with a hammer. So it doesn't seem like Stone was the greatest conversationalist. Stone begged to be admitted as an inpatient, and he actually wanted to go to Broadmoor, as in a high secure psychiatric unit, but this was refused. On top of all that, he fit the epithet of the police description from Crime Watch. So Stone's friends dobbed him in, including a friend telling police that they'd seen him with blood-soaked clothes on the day before the murder, and Stone told them that he'd been in a fight. You could say, with friends like these, who needs enemies? But then again, with friends like Stone, who needs serial killers? Stone attempted suicide at least twice whilst he was on remand. Okay, so this is where this story is all leading to. What impact did this case affect the world of forensic psychiatry? And why was I taught about this case of Stone specifically during my training to become a forensic psychiatrist? So this case actually helped change the whole Mental Health Act, because following Stone's conviction, an inquiry was held into the case, into the care that he'd received both from drug and alcohol addiction services and mental health services. He'd actually threatened to kill his probation officer and the probation officer's family and other criminal justice staff and psychiatric nurses just days before he carried out this horrific murder on the Russells. So I guess the inquiry very reasonably were questioning why, if there were clear warning signs, why were the murders not prevented and what should have happened? The Health Secretary proposed a reform of the entire Mental Health Act, and then they released a white paper about this. Okay, so listen up nerds, here comes the science. The previous 1983 Mental Health Act had a treatability test. So that was one part of it, and it said that patients could only be detained, only be sectioned, if their mental disorders were considered treatable. So Stone was diagnosed with psychopathy or possibly an antisocial personality disorder. So I won't go into that into detail because this video would be too long, but very briefly speaking, antisocial personality disorder is an ingrained character flaw where the person doesn't have empathy, they don't know or care about the difference between right and wrong, they don't care about the rights of others, they tend to be aggressive and impulsive, they tend to offend habitually, they tend to be career criminals. Psychopathy is all those things, but extra layers on top, so being extra manipulative, charming, deceitful, etc., etc. I've done an entire series on psychopaths if you're interested, and of course you are, otherwise why would you be watching a channel like this? Then you should check that series out, including my experiences of working for a psychopath, in my view, my experiences of treating a psychopath who ended up escaping our hospital, if you can believe that, and also my analysis on whether Michael Jordan would be a psychopath according to the psychopath test. Always be plugging. However, when the Mental Health Act was changed, the change allowed the government to detain individuals who had not committed a crime. So in my opinion, there's a kind of a gap in the system here. So there's a grey area, which is exactly where Michael Stone sat. And the responsibility for his treatment is unclear, because he had been in prison in the past, but at that point, should he have been in prison leading up to that killing? Obviously without the knowledge of knowing that he would go on to commit these killings, if that makes sense. So firstly, I don't know if the threats to kill were taken seriously or not, because making a threat to kill is against the law. It's a criminal offence. So he could have potentially been arrested at that point. But in my opinion, this is speculation, staff probably found it easier to just dismiss Stone, to kind of let him calm down and just to get rid of him. In addition to that, staff might have been worried that if he did get arrested, that the charges might not have been serious enough for him to be incarcerated or taken to prison. So he might have been released on bail, and he might have been even angrier at the targets because they complained to the police. So they might have actually felt scared of him, which kind of paradoxically is the reason they didn't complain to the police, possibly. Another issue is that even if he or people like him were detained, say to a psychiatric hospital without a treatable mental illness like psychopathy, then you're kind of wasting the expertise and resources of the forensic psychiatric system. As to whether psychopathy is treatable or not is a huge debate that I don't have time to go into, but maybe I will make a video about that one day. So, why am I talking about this? Because this all sparked off a dangerous and severe personality disorder program, which has to be the biggest failure of an initiative since the Justice League or the rap group Slaughterhouse. All right, first let's go into what is the background of the DSPD scheme. Let's take it back to the concrete. Oh, already did that. So prior to the changes of the Mental Health Act, so there was a new version from 1983 to 2007, as I said, it was difficult to detain people with personality disorders, even if they posed a risk to the public, because two psychiatrists who did the sectioning process had to agree on a number of things, but one thing is they had to certify that the patient was treatable. But after this change in the Act, that was no longer the case. So now you can detain them, even though there's little evidence that they would benefit from treatment of being psychiatrically sectioned. So psychiatrists felt that they were being pressurised into locking people up, especially towards the end of their prison sentence when they were already in prison, because there was no other legal way of detaining them. And this all happened, this was all spurred on by a number of bad things in the 1990s. And I'm not talking about the curtain hairstyle that you used to rock. I'm talking about, of course, the several high-profile cases of violent offenders being released from prison. Even though they'd served their debt, they were still thought to be a risk to society, and a number of murders by psychiatric patients. And although Michael Stone's wasn't the only one, it was probably the one that was most examined most thoroughly under a microscope. It was the most high profile. Then the new Labour government proposed changes in the law, and they amended the Mental Health Act to remove the treatability clause. So thus they removed this barrier to detention, and they also proposed a new form of detention on the basis that the patient could be diagnosed with dangerous and severe personality disorder. So why is this diagnosis controversial? Before I answer that question, let me introduce you to this channel. My name is Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. I assess mentally disordered offenders in courts and in prisons and secure psychiatric units. I act as an expert witness where I give evidence in court in criminal trials. A lot of YouTubers talk that shit, but I'm about that life. You can call me the ominous Shahominous. I am your favourite Asian-based forensic psychiatrist, YouTuber who lives in London, or at least in your top 3. On this channel, you'll see a whole range of smorgasbord of videos related to mental health and offending and the crossover between the two. So for example, I will dissect high-profile true crime cases and give my own psychoanalysis. I've kind of mentioned one here in this video, but I don't have time to do my psychoanalysis of Stone because there's so many other things to talk about. But I do in other videos. For example, the psychopath Joanna Dennehy, who went on a killing spree, probably one of Britain's most notorious female serial killers. I've talked about the case of Nicola Edgington, who went on a killing spree in 2011, who was psychotic and murderous, despite asking for help and despite suffering from schizophrenia, despite deteriorating, she was not helped. I do a whole range of videos, and there's something for everybody on this channel. I implore you to subscribe, because not only does it help me out immensely, but it will prevent your partner from snoring and keeping you up, guaranteed, or your money back. Okay, let's get schmacked to the case. Why is this diagnosis controversial? Because it was not a clinical term, and it's not a recognised diagnosis. It doesn't exist in, ICD-10, DSM, etc. dangerous is not a straightforward and very nebulous concept. So some people might call somebody dangerous in one circumstance, but other people might beg to differ. They were detained on what they might do in the future rather than what they've done in the past. So obviously Mike and Stone went on to commit horrific crimes, but what if there was somebody else whose bark is worse than their bite? Under the new DSP program, they're potentially being locked up indefinitely. Another issue, I'll stop that now. Another issue was that it was felt that debate in Parliament of the new Mental Health Act all became focused about containing dangerous people and criminals. And for example, there was hardly any attention into progressing mental health legislation to help all the other people who are mentally ill who deserve and need help. So for example, there was very little thought about improving patients' access to treatment, which is an issue that is still a problem now, almost 15 years later. So attention was taken away to all these dangerous people. And despite the fact that forensic psychiatrists cried out in protest, loads of us said we don't want this to go ahead, the DSD program was still commenced. So what do we want? Dangerous and severe personality program. When don't we want it? At any time in the foreseeable future. In fact, ever, coming to think of it, is how I imagine those protests to have gone. So what happened with the DSD program? There was a whole bunch of new treatments and new risk prediction tools were made and were funded by the government. All these hospitals and prison units were set up and a pilot scheme ran for 10 years. Now, I don't know if you've ever made a pilot before, but it's usually just one episode. And many professionals felt that the whole scheme was deceitful and it was just kind of smoke and mirrors. And also there was a criticism that the research from it was tainted. So for example, the researchers used different approaches to what was accepted as the scientific norms. For example, there was no control group. So there was no way of determining whether all this therapy and all this effort was actually effective in a scientific way if you don't have anything to compare it with. And there was a feeling that people involved were just talking about how everyone was doing so well and how everyone was progressing, but there was little in terms of actual scientific results backing this up. And also, how can you really tell if people are progressing if everybody was locked up for decades anyway? So it kind of felt like the people involved were sort of bigging it up and talking about how good it was, whereas in actual fact, it was a little bit lame, a bit like The Empire's New Clothes or Squid Game. I mean, I thought Squid Game was okay, original idea, terrible acting, but it wasn't amazing. I thought it was overrated. Tell me, viewers, am I wrong? Tell me your thoughts. Is Squid Game amazing, or do you agree with me? Let me know in the schmomment below. Some felt like the researchers were being paid by the government and the government wanted to have good results because they've invested so much money in it and also because politically it made them look good. They seemed to be tackling a problem. So some criticised that it was in both of their interests, researchers and government, to make it look as if everything was going great. So there were no scientifically vigorous questions being asked or answered. So to me, that's kind of like, it reminds me of those sycophantic YouTubers who try to curry favour with their viewers by complimenting them instead of actually putting out decent material. And I would never do that to you, dear viewers, because you're such an intelligent audience. You would never fall for that. Right, so then in 2011, the coalition government expanded the DSPD programme even further. So dear viewers, can you have a guess of the sum that was spent over 10 years in developing this programme? The answer will make your eyes gurgle and your bowels widen, guaranteed, or your money back. Answers later on in this episode. So at its peak, there were 240 people, patients, individuals, prisoners, guinea pigs, clientele in this programme in 4 different centres. 2 were in special hospitals, so those are high secure hospitals, Rampton and Broadmoor. By the way, if you're interested in Broadmoor, and many people are, see my series of previous videos about what it's like for patients in Broadmoor, what it's like to work in Broadmoor. I used to work there myself. And also, more interestingly, some high-profile previous patients in Broadmoor, like David Copeland, the nail bomber, Ronnie Cray, and Charles Bronson. So I've done my own psychoanalysis and detail of what I think about those people. Always be plugging. Yeah, and the DSPD programme was also in 2 high secure category A prisons, which were HMP Frankland and HMP Whitemoor. So what were the criteria for DSPD? How did somebody fit into this diagnosis? it was this: that the person is more likely than not to commit an offence within 5 years that would be expected to lead to serious physical or psychological harm, plus a significant disorder of personality, and the risk presented appears to be linked to the personality disorder. So as you can see, there's lots of problems with this definition. The criteria are vague, and one part of it even involves predicting in future, kind of necessitating somebody looking into into crystal balls. And also you could argue that if they were likely to commit a violent offence within 5 years, then by definition they've got a personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder. So like, if they fulfill the first part of the definition, then they automatically fulfill the second part. So what's the point of it all, I guess, is what I'm saying. Some people felt the Department of Health was just being manipulative and deceitful. So, for example, during the literature it published, it expressed this sincere desire to help out these desperate people who needed an extra form of treatment, the people that fit into the DSPD criteria. Whereas in actual fact, it was for public protection and it's for their own political gains. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong. Public protection is not a bad agenda, but I'm just saying that some people felt it was dishonest, that they were trying to pretend it was something when it wasn't. So I think that might have been the only time in history when politicians have ever been dishonest. Pretty sure about that. A further criticism was that this DSPD diagnosis, this magic catch-all diagnosis, suddenly appeared without any involvement from the experts. The experts being forensic psychiatrists like myself. And I have to say, we're a sensitive group. We need our egos kind of stroked, clearly, hence this YouTube channel. It was also felt that this whole project was a bit like warehousing. What I mean by that is keeping prisoners to be parked for long periods of time and preventing them to be released even after they'd served their sentence. Another criticism was that there was a lot of inactivity apparently in detention. So the therapy program, the DSPD stuff, was only a tiny proportion of their time, and everyone else was just sitting around doing very little. And that kind of happens to a degree in prison, but it's not what hospital should be for, especially considering how much time and effort and staff and specialist forensic psychiatrists who take years of training are thrown into the whole project. It just felt like it wasn't a good use of resources. So analysis showed that the amount pushed into the cost of the program was consistently greater than the monetary value of the expected benefits. And that was measured in terms of decreasing reoffending within this particular group. So what I'm saying is that there was an argument that even though it was a laudable effort, it was wasting money on people who don't deserve it, and it was money from the NHS when there isn't enough money from the NHS for other decent treatment. So it's kind of like a waste of money, a bit like your anal warts. So, dear viewers, can you have a guess of the sum that was spent over 10 years in developing this programme? Drum roll please. It was in excess of £200 million, which is about the equivalent of 3 sandwiches from W.H. Smith's inside an airport. Having said all of that, a bit like spending Christmas with your racist grandparents who are generous gift givers, it wasn't all bad. In terms of balance, I'm going to tell you about some, even though they're quite minor, some positive outcomes of this whole thing. So there have been a lot of different forms of treatment have developed from the DSPD programme, such as cognitive and interpersonal psychotherapy and the Good Living treatment and the development of GLAD projects. So these are all forms of psychotherapy for violent offenders, some of which have been centred around immediate rewards that are given to these people for positive behaviour. Which reminds me, if you subscribe right now, and if you haven't done already, I will give you this cookie. So editor, can you just please insert a cookie in this bit here, post-production, and make it kind of large and, chocolatey. We need to convince these fools to subscribe. Anyway, other pros from this project: even though the psychological treatments might not have had much success in terms of research base, they've led to more kind of attention, more funding for this group of people, and they've helped with comorbid disorders that are more treatable, things like depression, for example. There's also been some development and like a kindling of interest into personalities in general, leading to other pilot programs of less intense and more kind of scientifically proven and less bullshitty personality disorders. So for example, the NICE guidelines, so you might have heard of NICE, it's the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence. they kind of give guidelines about NHS and medical treatment. They've recommended that every geographical area should have a personality disorder service in their community mental health team. And this has all happened, at least partially, has occurred due to the attention given by the DSPD programme. I love those people that work at NICE. They're so, pleasant. And England is the only country in the world that has a countrywide personality disorder service programme. And again, this is all at least partially due to the DSPD programme. Perhaps the biggest benefit of the whole initiative is that I've been able to make this episode for you, beautiful, beautiful people. So the patients and the prisoners themselves, the DSPD people, had generally negative perceptions of the programmes. They complained about there being really long waiting lists for therapy, even after they'd been admitted. So they've gone to these units and they still have to wait for the therapy to start for weeks or months due to a lack of staff. So let's keep it moving to the KIM. I ain't got no time for shucking and jiving. The conclusion is this. The DSPU movement was a bold move with laudable aims, but it seemed like a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to some horrific crimes. And there might have been some pros and some advantages, but it seems like a situation where politicians kind of bullied clinicians and it was all a massive waste of money for you, the taxpayer, or if you're a relative of David Cameron's, the tax dodger. So in this episode, we learnt about the case of Michael Stone, horrific, senseless, random murders that sparked off the DSPD programme. We learnt about why experts frowned upon this diagnosis and its research, and we learnt about how much it cost and why it was a waste of money. So why should you care, dear viewers? Well, I think you need to watch your civil liberties, otherwise you might be detained indefinitely even after you have repaid your debt to society. Dun dun dun! Okay, dear viewers, before we finish, do you have any examples of government wasting money? Even more than this, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think about the whole DSD programme. I love chatting to you guys when I have the time. I've got a book coming out in March 2022. It's a bit like this channel, but a bit more intellectual, more of a deep dive, more autobiographical, and a lot more about my own personal cases. And if you can't read, then don't worry, I've also recorded an audio book which will be out in the usual areas. Please, please, please share this channel with other people and get them to subscribe, and you subscribe if you haven't yourself. Not only does it help me out immeasurably, but it stokes my ego. I'm a very insecure man, so I need that. That's all I have to say. Stay euthymic, and whatever happens, do not forget, I love you.